Yeah.
All
Okay.
right. Sweet. And we're on the air. Everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. I am joined here with Dr. Dennis McKenna. Dennis, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks so much for asking me. Really
Yes,
appreciate it. Thank
it's,
you.
of course. It's truly a pleasure. I really, for a lot of years, I've been studying your work, your brother Terrence's work, and you guys are really pioneers in, you know, the psychedelic movement, you could say. And so I'm excited to learn from you and, spread some knowledge to the listeners about it, because I haven't had too many episodes on psychedelics itself yet. Um, so I wanted to start off by asking, with your own personal studies, usage, whether it be, your own personal experiences mystically or scientifically, what have you sort of been able to learn about the nature of humans in regards to our sort of interconnectivity or our connection to nature, through your interactions with these plants? And, why might that sort of knowledge be so important right now, especially with everything we're going through? I mean, I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, that is a multi-layered question for sure.
Oh yeah.
People often ask me that question. I've been doing psychedelics for many years, been involved with them for many years, personally and professionally as an object of scientific curiosity and study. And they say, "What have you learned?"
Mm-hmm.
And the paradox of it is, what I've learned is how little I know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the psychedelics really remind a person of the limitations of their knowledge, and kind of the realization that uh, however much you think you know, it's not very much, in a certain sense. And there's always an infinitely more greater amount of things that you don't know. And it seems like the more you expand your sphere of knowledge, the greater the great unknown out there expands to compensate it. And that sounds trivial and maybe even a little silly. But I think that that's the lesson. The lesson is that when I think psychedelics are a gentle reminder, and sometimes not so gentle reminder, that you don't, whatever we think we know, it's a limited knowledge of the world, and we never will fully understand the
Right.
universe, the cosmos, reality, or our place in it. That doesn't mean that we can't keep trying,
Mm-hmm.
because the reward is in the attempt. It's kind of like a journey is not getting to the destination. The journey is what happens along the way. And I
Right.
think as we all careen through life, we are on a kind of journey, and we're putting together our own narrative. And so, you know, uh, in that sense, I think that, if people ask what is the main takeaway from psychedelic experiences, is the realization and the willingness to admit that you don't have it figured out. You only have probably not very much of it, maybe nothing.
Right.
you know, and so the other side of that is, that might be very depressing to many
Mm,
people. It's like, well, I'm never going to figure this out. I don't find it depressing. I find it actually kind of exciting, because it means there's no excuse for boredom, or
mm.
you're never going to reach a point where you think, well, I pretty much got this figured out. And if anybody tells you they have it figured out, run the other way, because my contention is nobody knows what's going
Right.
on just about every level. And I think that's one thing that psychedelics remind us of, and then so there are other aspects to it too. I mean, people, often do get this sense through their experience of the connectedness of things, and maybe a feeling of their place in this huge cosmic scheme of things. Uh, and it can seem that we're very small. I mean, we are very small. We're, an individual person is like a drop in the ocean, a
Hmm.
drop in the ocean of mind, if you will. We're an individual consciousness. Uh, but at the same time, through psychedelics, they remind us that we are connected to everything, and we're all part of this, this community of consciousness,
Right.
and which I feel is not, I feel it's not limited to human consciousness. It's, if you will, it is the Gaian consciousness, if I can use that term. And I think that these substances are essentially messengers from Gaia. I like to think of them that way,
Mm.
that they are messenger molecules in the biological sense. They serve, neurotransmitters, hormones, and things like that within the body are signal transduction molecules. They carry a message, and that's how they work. The same thing goes on in nature. Nature, complex ecosystems are really woven together. They are, you can think of them as superorganisms. They're woven together by signal transduction processes.
Hmm.
And signal transduction is obviously a signal, but it's a specific kind of signal. It's a signal that involves a, a chemical substance traveling from the emitter, whatever that is, to a target, usually some receptor on the surface of a cell or whatever. So that's the biological sense of signal transduction. And if you
Hmm.
look at any complex ecosystem, it's all tied together through these signal transduction processes, the plants, the fungi, everything else. They communicate in many ways, but they certainly communicate on this molecular level, and so that is out there. And uh, if you, I mean, it's interesting how many of these, the psychedelics, for example, are similar to neurotransmitters,
Right.
right? And so that's obviously why they affect the way the
Hmm.
brain works, because they target those same receptors. But they probably evolved from an evolutionary precursor where they were signal transduction molecules in the ecosystem, not for internal signaling, but actually for external signaling. And they've been, repurposed and readapted to function as neurotransmitters. And it's
Hmm.
just, it's just it's the outcome of evolution. I don't know that there's any grand design, but it is the situation that we find,
Right.
so
Definitely.
like that.
And that sort of complexity that exists that you talk about with all these this sort of super organisms that exist within us, and it's sort of like,
Within us as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
and it's sort of, I
yeah,
found like it's like that reminder that, hey, we are nature, we have this complexity within us. Because I think a lot of times humans, we've been taught to really only view ourselves on this very much a surface level, shallow type of identity, whether it third dimensional identities, all these, this baggage we carry, all this conditioning. And so we're very much disconnected from the source of nature, especially, we were talking about how I'm moving to LA soon. I'm going to be in a huge concrete jungle, like the opposite of nature. Like that's, there's
right.
all of, there's so much, there's so many people who have that disconnect. And, I think psychedelics sort of have that potential, like you were saying, to sort of reestablish that connection and sort of give that reminder that there is so much out there that we don't know. And, when we look
Yeah,
at what do people need most right now in the world, it is to expand their lens and sort of evolve their consciousness and be able to look at things from sort of an abstract point of view, if you will. And I think the potentials of that is sort of where humanity needs to go if we are to evolve as a species? Because I think what we're doing right now is clearly not
Yeah,
working.
I agree. I think, I mean, the big problem, maybe the biggest problem that is the root of all our problems, is the fact that we have become, like you say, disconnected from nature. Or at least there is that sense. I mean, you could say there's no way you can become disconnected from nature because we are immersed in nature, like it or not. But we lose the sense of that connection, and the psychedelics can remind us of that. And that's very important. And one of the ways that we tend to build up around ourselves, we insulate ourselves from nature and other people and even ourselves in a certain sense by creating this illusion, which I sometimes call the reality hallucination.
Mm.
And now I think the more current, more neuroscience-y term that's applied to that is the default mode network, which is essentially something the brain does. It's a set of behavioral responses combined with memory and whatever comes into us through sensory channels and associations and habits and presumptions, and all of these things come together to create this model of reality that we live in. And it isn't reality. It's a model of reality. Fortunately for us, it resembles reality. We assume it has practical uses, but then physics and other types of science will tell us, well, actual reality, it doesn't look anything like this. But if we saw it, which we can occasionally when we take psychedelics, but it's very confusing. It's very hard to comprehend. So we construct out of practical necessity this model of reality, which we then proceed to inhabit. And most of the time, that's fine. We're the producers and directors and stars of our own movie, and we create this internal narrative that is our being in the world, moving through time. But it's important once in a while to remind ourselves that that is, in fact, an illusion.
Right.
And psychedelics are good from that because they can temporarily disrupt this default mode network. They demolish these neural gating mechanisms. The brain, a lot of what the brain does, it keeps information out. It's developed very sophisticated neural gating mechanisms to filter out, I don't know, probably 75% of what it would perceive if those gates weren't there. Right. Most of the time, we don't need to apprehend that. It's not of practical significance. So it's easy to push it into the background, but that doesn't mean it's not important, and at certain times with the psychedelics, they can disrupt that default mode network, and effectively they bring the background forward, so you notice things in the environment that you might never notice before, right. Unless you experience them in a hyper sensitive state. I think certain people, certain situations, children, for example, or maybe indigenous people, they have many fewer filters, and it's kind of like they're on psychedelics all the time, in a certain way that they have, they perceive things. And it's not that, I mean, sometimes on psychedelics, you see things that, aren't there, right? I mean, right. They couldn't possibly be there. But a lot of what it does is you see things that are definitely there, but you never noticed them before, or you never noticed them in the way that you notice them, Right. So this ability of psychedelics to kind of temporarily disrupt this cozy little cocoon you create around yourself, this artificial reality, and actually look at reality in the raw to a certain extent, and also get this perspective on yourself, the ability to kind of step temporarily outside this cocoon, outside this artificial reference frame that you
Yeah.
create. And that, I think, is the basis of a lot of the therapeutic properties of psychedelics, just giving you a way to look at your existential situation from kind of arm's length, you know. And if your issue is trauma or addiction or other types of things, being able to distance yourself from that and look back at yourself as though you were observing someone else, it can be tremendously therapeutic. It can be integrating, because then you can see, well, you know, this puppet, if you will, or this robot that I drive around most of the time, you
Hmm.
know, is doing various things that are not helpful, not good
Right.
for me, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot about what psychedelics do on the therapeutic level.
Definitely. And it's sort of it like you were saying, it lifts that veil of what you think is reality. And you can sort of it's like looking at yourself from a higher perspective, another person's point of view, and you can get to that
Mm-hmm.
root cause, if you will. I mean, I've been very I know you do a lot of work with ayahuasca ceremonies. I've been very called to
Mm-hmm.
partake in one of those. I've yet to have the opportunity to do that. I know down the line that'll be something I engage with, and I'm very intrigued by it because it sort of it lifts that veil in a way to where you can look at things at the root cause. And I'm very when we look at like Western traditional medicine, it's always about symptoms, and it's always about sort of masking what it is that's causing let's say it's mental illness. If you have depression or anxiety or PTSD, a lot of
Right.
times they'll just prescribe some sort of pill that you pop to make temporarily numb your experience of it. And what's intriguing about I find, especially with like an ayahuasca ceremony or shamanic healing, it is that direct root and facing that trauma, whatever it may be, and being able to uh, move on from it afterwards and sort of integrate the experience of facing that, I think is uh, incredibly important, and something that we don't really emphasize as a culture. And that's something I want to see change. But I think that
Right.
sort of threatens a lot of the like if we were to take that approach, it sort of threatens a lot of the constructs that we think is reality. It threatens a lot of the whether it be the pharmaceutical industry or the sort of corporative money making off of treating symptoms, and
Right.
sort of threatens our version of reality, I would say.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Yeah, psychedelics are. I mean, it's exactly right. The current biomedical models for mental illness are kind of a joke in a certain
Hmm.
way, you know. Uh, and it's partly because of the way that medicine is structured economically, and you know, in partnership with the pharmaceutical industry. And you know, if a person has problems, you know, they go to a therapist or they go to a mental health professional, maybe a psychologist or whatever. If they're lucky, they get 15 minutes with that person, you know,
Right.
and then they usually leave. They expect to leave, and they are not disappointed. They expect to leave with a prescription, and they do, and that's pretty much the end of it. And if they're lucky, they get another consult with the therapist. But it's you cannot use psychedelics within this context. You
Right.
know, they won't work because they force you to look more deeply into your problems and get at the root of what's going on. And you need therapeutic help often to get those insights. So you need a skilled therapist who knows that territory and who is able to spend a long time with the patient, you know. I mean, and not just in the session, but leading up to it and during the session, and then processing it afterwards. So it's likely to tie up a therapist's time for for days,
Right.
potentially. Well, that's not a very good that's not a good revenue model, but
Right.
that is what is necessary. And so I'm curious. I mean, I'm delighted that psychedelics are finally getting recognition for the therapeutic, promise that they have. At the same time, I'm I'm curious, how is this going to be integrated into medical practice? You basically have to completely reinvent psychiatry and mental health care, in order to assimilate psychedelics.
Right.
And that's a good thing. That's needed. But will it happen? And I think we don't know yet.
Right.
Judging by the proliferation of startup companies that want to bring psilocybin, or mostly it's psilocybin, but they want to bring psychedelics into the clinic in this way. Uh, that's very encouraging. But I think in the actual implementation of it, there may be problems that haven't been anticipated. How
Right.
is that going to work? Uh, the whole approach to psychiatric medicine, psychopharmaceutical driven psychiatry, really harkens back to the notion 200 years ago, or longer, but 200 years ago is about when it happened, around the turn of the 19th century. The idea that we're just complex machines. We
Hmm.
we don't really have a mind and a spirit and all that. We're just complex machines, and if we apply the right monkey wrench in terms of the right medicine, you can fix the machine. And all of that, or much of that, sprung from, I think, when it became clear that uh, you could take something like opium
Hmm.
and isolate morphine out of it. And morphine has many of the properties of opium, right? It's an analgesic, it causes euphoria, it's addictive, it does all these things. But it is clearly not alive. It's a
Right.
crystalline inert compound, and yet it has these properties. And I think it led to a perception in Western medicine that everything can be reduced to chemistry,
Hmm.
and that it sparked the beginning of the exorcism of the soul out of medicine, the acknowledgement that there is a soul. And you know and this kind of medicine, reductionist medicine, kind of said, well, no, it's not like that. We're just complex machines. Find the right key and we can fix the machine, just like we might take the car to the mechanic.
Right.
And then along comes this generation of medicine, or these new medicines, which are in no sense new, right? They've been used for thousands of years in shamanic traditions, but this kind of, they're new to medicine, and I think they're best described, they're medicines for the soul.
Mm.
Well, so if you use these medicines in that context to treat the soul, you have to admit that the soul exists,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I think they are medicines for the soul, not only the individual soul, but the collective soul, and maybe even the planetary soul.
Right.
That's another thing that concerns me about, the corporate co-optation of these medicines, which were formerly thought of as really sacred medicines with a spiritual aspect to them, a spiritual significance. Medicine is uncomfortable when you start talking about these things. They don't want you talking about spirits.
Right.
That harkens back to an earlier age, and yet you do have this sense that, before there was plant chemistry, before there was phytochemistry, and people were isolating individual molecules out of plants, the earlier model was that in fact there were spirits in plants, you
Right.
know, and that's the shamanic idea. That whether it's true or not, I'm not saying that, but that was the operating premise. And in fact, early chemical manipulations of plants were really motivated by attempt to remove the spirit or concentrate the spirit from plants. That's where the term spirits come from.
Right.
You know, alcoholic distillates are called spirits. And it springs from an earlier age where they actually were trying to concentrate the spirits. This is how it was understood. And out of that came, you know, reductionist chemistry,
Right.
basically from the alchemical roots to the reductionist
Right.
invention of chemistry.
Definitely. And, you know, I, whenever I talk about sort of science, and whenever you combine science and mysticism, there is always sort of that skeptical of approach of, oh, science, like spirituality, all of that needs to be separate. There's no place for it. But if you think about it, even science and sort of the scientific method in itself is a human construct that is from our own limited human perspective. Like we've created it almost in unison with our other constructs that we sort of live by in this reality. So there needs, along with, you know, all other facets of life that we talk about expanding that lens. I think, you know, science and the scientific method needs to fit into that category of evolution as well. We can't necessarily think that we have this perfect scientific model.
I'm doing a podcast right now. Sorry.
Can I run the wash?
But yeah, we can't necessarily think we have this perfect scientific model per se. And I think it needs to be open for growth. And how would you say we sort of get that community to expand its lens as well? Because I do see a lot of pushback on that just from, you know, my own research. And I'm not even a scientist by any means, but I sort of encounter that whenever I sort of try and dabble the fields together, if you will.
Well, I think a couple of things. I think that for one thing, psychedelics can be a very useful teaching tool, especially for scientists. You know, because science tends to be kind of arrogant about what it thinks it has figured out, and the reality is it has very little figured out. And scientists could benefit from being reminded of that. And I think it was Aldous Huxley who said, you know, the people who think they know what's what don't know what's what.
Right.
And they should be taking medicine. They should be taking mescaline or whatever to remind them of that. So in one sense, I think it's very useful for that. And I also think that science as it is practiced today is I think that scientists should be forced, they should be required to take courses in philosophy of science. Because philosophy of science forces them to think about what is science, what is it really? You know, and in this era of big science, where everything is driven by, you know, corporate interests and finances and, you know, grants and these huge institutions, and there's always a goal. You know, we're doing this because we want the cure for cancer, or we want to split the atom, or we want to do these things. It's very rare that scientists have the luxury to step back and say, what am I doing here? You know, what is this? And in its pure form, science is the search for truth. You know, it's a tool that we have to expand our understanding of nature. And it's a very powerful tool because it gives us a tool that we can ask very structured questions to nature. We can put questions to nature in the form of hypotheses, right? This is how it's supposed to work. you have an idea about a phenomenon that you're trying to understand. You think, well, I think it works this way, and these things are going on, and then you can test that hypothesis against observation, against data. And if it doesn't fit the data, then you have to revise the hypothesis, or entirely throw it out the window and make a new one. That's the way science is supposed to work, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum. That's pure science.
Right.
Few people have the luxury to practice pure science these days, but we need more of it, and we also, again, because of this, we really need to, scientists especially, need to pursue their craft in the light of the understanding of how limited our knowledge is, and really how limited the scientific method is. This is one reason why I founded my academy. It's called the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, not natural science, because I am a scientist, I value science, but I also, natural philosophy is what science was. It was the precursor to science before it became reductionist,
Right.
and entirely preoccupied with quantitation and measurement. And natural philosophy, science evolved out of natural philosophy, but natural philosophy admits that there are other ways of knowing that are legitimate, that are not quantitative, not reductionist. And that doesn't mean that we should just accept every cockamamie notion about how things are. It's good to be able to test hypotheses, and have some way to evaluate something. Otherwise, it's just a mess, I mean,
Right.
the craziest ideas will become accepted, and I don't think that's good either. That's erring on the other side. So I think that psychedelics play a role in this, in teaching us a different way to think about this stuff,
Right.
and a different way to observe even. A writer, you may be familiar with Simon Powell. He's written very interestingly about psilocybin and written 3 or 4 books. One of them was the psilocybin solution. I think the latest one is the Magic Mushroom Explorer. But in his second book, which I think was Darwin's Unfinished Business, he talks about how psychedelics can be a lens through which we view reality and notice things about it that we normally overlook. As we were saying before, they bring the background forward. Right. And these observations that you make by kind of removing the veil of your assumptions as you examine a phenomenon lets you appreciate it in a way that you didn't before, and actually gain insights about it that were not possible unless you were in this very receptive state that psychedelics create for you. And this is this is legitimate. This is, we know, for example, that I think it was Crick or Watson. I think it was Crick who eventually admitted on his deathbed, practically. He always denied that he ever took LSD, but as he was getting on in life, he admitted that, and he admitted that his experiences gave him insights into the structure of the double helix. And Kary Mullis is another one. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, which was a huge advance in molecular biology, and is used in forensics and all of these things. And he was quite upfront about admitting that, his experiences with LSD gave him the ability to visualize what was going on a molecular level. He said, you know, I could get down with the molecules and see what was going on in this VR artificial reality that he was able to hallucinate or visualize. And it turns out he was right,
Right.
you know. And then so he came. So I think that in many ways, psychedelics are learning tools in that respect. You know, and it depends on what the topic is, what you're learning. You know, and there's a lot of discussion perpetually about what do you call these things? Are they psychedelics? Are they hallucinogens? Are they
Right.
mystical mimetics or whatever? And most of the terms are quite awkward and not totally accurate. You know, and one of the reasons is that, you know, they can do almost anything because what they do is so dependent on set and setting. You know, you can have almost any outcome. And
Right.
I was rereading Terence's book, The Food of the Gods, recently. And because I've been asked to write a foreword about it, there's going to be a new edition come out, and they asked me, so I thought I better go back and have a look at it. And I thought he talks about how these things used to be called consciousness expanding drugs, and maybe that's a good term. You know, I mean, that's almost as good as psychedelics.
Right.
You know, because psychedelic means mind manifesting, and it's deliberately a vague term. I mean, hallucinogen is not right because you don't always have hallucinations. They rarely do in a lot of them. But psychedelic is a useful term, even though it has all this cultural baggage. But it's also kind of accurate to describe what they do. Whatever they do, they manifest the mind. Not necessarily in the way you hoped, but they will manifest the mind.
Right. It's always in the way you need, you know, not the way you hope.
It's always in the way you need. Yes, that's right.
Right. That's and I see what you're talking about with that sort of, I think that search for truth is a perfect way to put it. And I see a lot of parallels between almost sort of this, you know, we talk about the science and like scientific method being a search for truth about nature. And then there's these other ways we can search for truth about, you know, with psychedelics and through our own sort of personal experience, which it can be just as valuable as hard scientific data, you know, sort of trusting your own personal experience with it. And I think that is vital for people to really take on themselves, because there are so many people who are not empowered in a sense and don't sort of reach this stage of self-actualizing and sort of seeking truth and looking to sort of fulfill their own potential and sort of contribute to the evolution of, you know, humanity. And I think sort of this lack of empowerment at a societal level has almost created the stagnation that we're kind of in with, you know, all of the division and all of the systems and structures. Almost, I mean, you could almost say a lot of them are collapsing because they're unsustainable. And I think a lot of people are sort of like, oh no, what do I do? And don't necessarily know what to do. And that causes so much of the, you know, lack of individual empowerment that we see. And, you know, I think psychedelics are making this almost resurgence or reemergence because of the fact that it does offer that individual perspective of, you know, exploration and truth. And that's not something that our society really offered to us in a way, because we have commercialized and commoditized.
Not only not offered, but actively suppressed. You know,
Right.
I mean, Western culture especially has never valued inner experience. You know, I mean, Eastern culture is much more, you know, and because actually, for whatever reason, they operate under this worldview, which is, I think, closer to the way things actually are. You know, this notion that we live in a world of illusion, the world of Maya. I mean, That is scientifically true. I think the viewpoint of Eastern philosophy and indigenous people uh, is closer to the way it actually is than our view of it. You know, I mean that we in the West we lost a lot when we uh, bought into this illusion of or dualism of Cartesian dualism. You
Hmm.
know, and we've been sorting that out ever since. And the dualism is, well, you know, the mind is out there. We can't say anything about it. We can only say what we can measure in the physical world. Well, that's obviously, so you're going to eliminate half of of the whole picture and just say, well,
Hmm.
it's a black box. It's a mystery to us. It's not a mystery to us. We're living in it. You know, we're
Right.
living in this bubble of consciousness. We're living in our artificially constructed realities, and we have tools like psychedelics to actually help explore that and understand it. You know, and then I mean, and the insights can be valuable, but then you come up against the challenge, I guess, or the tendency of people to dismiss the, the validity of inner experience, the validity of psychedelic insights and all that, you know.
Right.
And some of them are, really dumb. I mean, some of them are not insights. And, after the trip, the next day or whatever, you look back and you can say, well, that was completely, stupid.
Right.
But occasionally you don't. Occasionally you look back and say that was an incredible insight. And that's the aha moment that you can come to, that potentially can change your life, can change a lot about your life, your behavior, or at least what you think you know,
Hmm.
So I think they're very valuable in that sense.
Right, definitely. And I think they also sort of offer that ability to, I think you mentioned earlier about sort of giving an emphasis on like what is it that matters? What is our sort of priority? It's almost like a moralist. It gives you like a deeper sense of like a more, for me personally too, like a deeper sense of moralistic, my own, like what is truly my morals as a human being. And we can sort of realize, um, it put ourselves outside of the box of that reality of, is everything about getting a nice job and owning nice material goods and having all of these things that we are told are going to be fulfilling for us and lead to happiness. And it kind of, but if you look at what is the cost of all of those material things, it is the destruction of the planet. It is, we
Yeah,
are viewing the earth as this finite resource. And when we sort of have this commodification mindset, and I think it gets you in touch with that. Well, I am nature. I see the beauty of this planet. It opens us up to beauty. And I think it gives us that like moralistic framework of, it is my duty to be a protector of this planet and work towards sort of becoming more harmonious with it and sort of
yeah, yeah. I
establishing that
think
symbiotic relationship.
that is the main message. That is one of the main messages that you can get from psychedelics, and I think uh, this is maybe the reason that, because clearly we're way out of sync with nature, we're way out of harmony,
Hmm.
and this is the root of so many of our problems. The fact that we are estranged from nature in profound ways. Psychedelics provide us a tool to maybe get back to that place, or at least recognize the problem and try to change our response to it. And again, this is going against the cultural wave, because people don't like, our culture does not like people who, not people,
Hmm.
but I don't want to put it that way, but they dislike the idea of simply sitting quietly and going into your mind and thinking, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and the culture is so against that they provide all sorts of ways to distract yourself, and there are so many, and they're, you know, all these shiny objects, and nobody's immune to it, really. I mean,
Right.
it's very seductive, it's
Mm-hmm.
very attractive. Sometimes you just have to push back and say, no, no, I'm going to find that core of stillness that is my being, you
Mm-hmm.
know, within myself. And of course, meditation and these sorts of things can do that. And people that can, you know, recover that place easily, spontaneously through meditation, more power to them. Some people require a little more than that, and that's where the psychedelics can come in. And then the benefits of meditation and that sort of thing following psychedelic experiences can be very useful, you know, to
Right.
keep that integration going and so on.
Right, definitely. And I found that after having psychedelic experiences, I did establish a deeper meditation practice and sort of a yearning for connection within, and sort of finding the true benefits of that. And I think I think if most people were to sort of engage in that in the psychedelic experience, would find that as well, and sort of realize there is more to unpack within ourselves. How would, you know, when we look at sort of the systems we live in, and every all of our sort of constructs, what is sort of like the next steps for people to take to sort of realize, like, let's, you know, a big part of, you know, taking psychedelics, let's say you take a psilocybin trip, and, you know, you have these insights. A big part of that is integration and working with,
Mm-hmm.
and actually you might have these insights, but how are you actually going to integrate them into your life and sort of make changes? What is sort of the, like, the steps that individuals like need to take to actually create this, like, systems that more emulate nature and more in tune with nature? Because, you know, the cities aren't going anywhere per se. Like, we're still going to have cars and planes and, you know, all of these, a lot of these different things. And, you know, technology, it's a beautiful thing. Like, we're sitting here chatting online, and it's, you know, having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation and able to share it with all these
Mm-hmm.
people. So what is sort of like the steps that need to be taken, like, at an individual level, to create that change and embrace that change?
Well, that's the hard question, you know, and I think it's partly an individual thing, and it's partly a collective thing. How do we, as individuals who have had these psychedelic revelations, how do we implement that in our lives that is, you know, I mean, before the trip and after the trip, that's true to ourselves? How do we implement these insights and really, I think that's also true on the collective level, you know, now, you know, and we see a kind of emerging consciousness that has been, you know, generations, several generations that have really been impacted by psychedelics. And I think it's helped foster the collective perception that, you know, we have to change as a species. We have to change radically, actually, because we don't, I mean, this is the unpleasant part, that, you know, these are wake up calls. They're trying to wake up the monkeys, you
Hmm.
know, and the monkeys don't wake up very easy, you know, and so it's like some kind of shock is necessary almost, you know, to really drive the lesson home. I think this is what COVID is,
Yeah.
in a certain sense. I think that COVID is another messenger from Gaia, you know, a different kind of messenger. And it's one that nobody can ignore this message, you know, and the message is slow down, I think. Pull
Hmm.
your elbows in a little bit, can stop this frenetic pace of consumption and depredation of the environment and all these, try to get back to some place where you seek to find a balance in society and in yourself. I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, I very often say in my talks that ayahuasca and these other plant teachers are really trying to wake us up. And I think they are. I think they're waking up a lot of people, but are they getting out there fast enough? That's the question, because we don't have a lot of time left. This is what is worrying to me. I mean, if we had had this conversation or been able to have it 30 years ago at the beginning of the 90s or something in that time frame, there was still time. Now time is growing short, and the homeostatic systems that maintain the planetary environment are having a harder and harder time of doing that,
Right.
because we're putting so much pressure on the systems. They're very resilient, but there is a point when they can't do it. They can't snap back, without a radical change.
Right.
Like, half the people on Earth die or something like that. And that's not really something we want to look at as a desirable thing.
Right.
Although realistically, maybe it is a desirable thing. And then, that becomes a very tough conversation.
Right.
I do think that one of the messages that's coming from COVID is to try to focus more on community and on our local environment and the people around us and all that. In the global travel industry, and God knows I'm as guilty as anybody, when it works, I'm always in motion. And last year I was doing so much travel, I'm beginning to realize, you've got to stop, or at least cut down. This is killing me, was my message to myself. And then COVID came along and said, well, you said you wanted to stop.
There you go.
Here I am.
You ain't going anywhere.
Ain't gone anywhere. So that's a gift, actually. I mean, to me, it's a gift just to have that time. Not that I seem to have any more free time, but at least I'm not moving around in different ways and
right.
with all the damage to myself and the damage to the environment that does.
Right.
So I think that's one of the messages, is that we have to refocus on our community, and that may be the model for survival, in a certain sense, because right now the global food systems they're run on petroleum, and it's all about monocultures and essentially industrial crops. And the strawberries we eat this morning were harvested in Chile yesterday, and these sorts of things. That is not sustainable,
Right.
because one of the things is we have to get away from fossil fuels, at least as much as possible. And, in the coming decades, I think things are going to get more and more challenging. Extreme weather events, sea level rises, obviously greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's all kind of coming together as a perfect storm.
Right.
And then on top of it, now we have this this awakening of people around the issues of social justice and racism and all that, which were always there and easily ignored. I mean, things would happen, and then everybody's wringing their hands, and then it all kind of settles back, and
Right.
we sweep it under the rug. But I think this may be different this time. I mean, it's not it's not every day that you see something like happened after George Floyd's murder
Right.
expands globally. I mean, we're seeing these demonstrations happening globally, and that's fantastic.
Right.
That's very hopeful to me, because what it is it's a pushback against racism, all these things. It's a pushback against this slide into authoritarianism, which is definitely happening. And
Right.
look at our country. I mean, our countries or meaning the United States. You know, uh, I mean, we're well along the way to becoming an authoritarian state.
Right.
And the people that, if we're not already, the people that think they run things, Trump and those people, they would love that. I mean, they really don't believe in freedom.
Right.
They believe in, I don't know what, they believe in a situation where they get to tell you what to think and you think it. And if you don't, you are a rebel.
Right.
And, you know, and I guess I'm a rebel. I guess anybody that works with psychedelics is a rebel. I mean, Terence used to say that psychedelics were dangerous because they gave you funny ideas, not because they're dangerous as drugs, but they
Right.
engender unconventional thinking. And that's always a threat to the powers that be,
Right.
and so in that sense too, psychedelics are catalysts for uh, exploring consciousness, but also reforming your perspective on things. So, yeah, psychedelics are definitely dangerous because they make
Mm.
you have dangerous ideas.
Right.
And I think that's the impulse. And all of this, the historical roots of all this are the Abrahamic religions, you know, um, which I could sit here and bash all day because I think you could lay a lot of our problems at the feet of these Abrahamic, patriarchal, essentially authoritarian religions,
Right.
that started in the Middle East and now dominate the world.
Hmm.
And and these religions, they have very little to do with spirituality.
Right.
They talk about spirituality. They're really authoritarian systems. They're designed to basically tell you what to think and discourage your thinking for yourself. I mean, because that's inherently threatening.
Right.
So and again, psychedelics are an antidote to that. That's why they had to be stamped out. That's why
Right.
the Mediterranean mystery religions had to be destroyed,
Hmm.
because it was seen as a threat to the authoritarian state religion of Christianity, which was gaining ascendancy at that time.
Right. And this like authoritarian state and the sort of powers that be, it's like they have their it's almost like their own uh bubble of consciousness, and they realize when there's a threat, when their bubble is in threat of being popped, they realize it and they're going to sort of squash that threat. And it's like psychedelics, it represents almost a new way forward because it provides solutions to all of these things that you mentioned that we're facing as a society. About why are we fighting against racism? Because we want to come together as community and
Hmm.
we want to walk hand in hand and be as one. And that's what psychedelics does. It emphasizes
Yeah.
community. And I think we do need sort of almost a decentralization of our food and a decentralization of sort of like we're placed in these hierarchies of uh, amongst people. Like, we're not viewed as equal. It's all competitive. It's all, we're supposed to fit into different classes and narratives. And i
Right.
think i think just the psychedelics really break down those barriers and break down those constructs of what we think is identity, and really,
Yeah. Of
allow.
separateness and all that. Yeah. Psychedelics, when you one of the main perceptions is, we are all one. There's no difference what your skin color is, what your sex is. None of these things matter. At base, we're all humans, and they do bring that perception home. So they, make it easier to form communities. And so, I think that they are part of the solution. So in some sense, I'm very encouraged by the fact that they're getting recognition again. They're not so stigmatized. People are beginning to realize they have some benefits, for at least from the therapeutic angle. And potentially they have the ability to transform society, in ways that it really needs transforming. And the question is, does it work fast enough? But
that's the $1 million question, right?
That's I guess we'll find out. Yeah, I guess we'll find out.
Can only hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, so with that, we're at about an hour. I mean, we've hit on a lot of great talking points. So Dennis, is there any place you would want to send the listeners to, maybe interact with your work more or learn more about, whether it be
Yes, absolutely. I would. So I have started this nonprofit called the McKenna Academy. I'm putting the website there. So McKenna.academy or www.mckenna.academy. So it's the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, and it's kind of the horse I'm riding now in terms of as an academy. Its mission is teaching and education, and a lot of it is teaching about these plant medicines. I call it a 21st century mystery school, and it was created in the spirit of Eleusis, which, Eleusis came to a bad end, right? But it was the longest existing mystery school in the Mediterranean till it was sacked and burned by the Goths in 396 AD. But hopefully that will not be the fate of the McKenna Academy.
I hope not.
But I want it to be a modern analog of the ancient mystery schools, a place for the exploration and consideration of all kinds of great ideas that you might bring to the table. And the overarching mission is to understand ourselves, our place in nature, and so on. And so that's the idea. Sometimes I tell people it'll be the first mystery school in 1500 years, and probably the first academy in which not all the faculty members are human.
That's beautiful. Well, we need more academies like that. I mean, I hope
more academies like that.
I hope more academies follow suit, and we start seeing, maybe it becomes almost like a McKenna Academy like franchise. We see them pop up all over the world, and
we've talked about this. But that's phase 2.
That's phase 2. Get it started now. Get the roots going, that foundation.
Right now, of course, a lot of what the Academy was going to do, what I was doing before, we'll get back to it, is to organize retreats and conferences in physical space and maybe do some of those in South America and so on. But since that's not happening, we're really focusing on getting a strong virtual presence online. And if you visit it, you can click into some of the cool things we've done in the last couple months, if you haven't already looked at it. And those things they're up there. They're not restricted in most cases. Anybody can access them. So take a look at it and put the link on your website if you can.
Sweet, definitely, and I'll have it linked in the episode description too. So everybody listening who wants to check it out, just scroll right down. It's right there, and I'll put the link out there, and everybody can go and check it out. So Dennis, thanks again so much for coming on. I mean, I really enjoyed talking with you. I feel like I learned a lot, a lot to
Oh,
process, and hopefully listeners are able to, feel some empowerment and, you know,
okay. Well, yeah, it was great talking to you, Evan. You're a good interviewer. I enjoyed this very much, and we'll do it again one of
all
these
right,
days.
let's
Yeah,
let's definitely plan on it. We can see what's the world's looking like post COVID or
yeah,
something, and
yeah, exactly. Check back then, and we'll see where we're at if
ex-
anybody's left standing. I think there will be a few. So,
there
yeah,
should be.
yeah,
Let's
I
hope.
hope so. Yeah. All right.
All right.
Very good, my friend. Thank
All
you.
right. I
Okay.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye.